Chag Sameach, Gemar Chatima Tova. Each year on the second day of Rosh Hashana, we are confronted by Abraham's binding of and almost sacrificing his son Isaac. It's there every morning of every day of every year. In the prefatory prayers before the first Kaddish in the morning, most mornings we glide past this chapter. Maybe it's just too challenging for an average Tuesday morning. Maybe if we stop to engage it and allow it to engage us, we would have no hope of going on to daven Shacharis, much less study a few lines of Gemara after the minyan, much less make it to work at all that day. God's voice calls out to Avraham and tells him to take your son, your only son whom you love, Yitzchak, and bring him up to the place that I will show you and make him into a sacrifice to me, says God. Avraham wakes up early in the morning, takes the boy, takes the wood, takes the knife, takes the fire, and takes his servants and his donkey, and sets off. His son asks him, "Where's the animal for the offering, Father? You seem to have brought everything else you need." "God will show us the offering," says the father to the son. They reach the place, they build the altar, the father ties up the son, he stretches out the knife. I'll stop there, I don't want to ruin the suspense for you. You read it yesterday, you read it last year, you think you know how it turns out? That was then, this is now. We're different people than we were when we read it last year, certainly 2 years ago. Why should the story be the same? The classical commentaries talk about what a test this was for Avraham, how he must have been anguished. This man whose essence was love, kindness, was now called upon to exercise not chesed, but gevura, severity, judgment. Or was he? Maybe this was another form of love. Is it possible to say? Among many modern voices, Rabbi Sachs says that the notion of child sacrifice is anathema to our values. In fact, little more can be as repugnant, obviously that's a Jonathan Sachs word, not mine, or as horrifying as the notion of sacrificing one's child for any reason, for any cause, for any test. It was a widespread cultural practice in those times, and as a result, the Torah forbids it clearly and unequivocally. So what was happening with the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, chapter 22 of Genesis, which we are brought face to face with each year, second day of Rosh Hashana? Clearly, it's something very important that we are meant to confront, meant to think about on this most holy, most special of days. We're still grieving our own loss this year, the passing of Rabbi Dr. Lord Jonathan Sachs. His insights and perspectives have illuminated our path for the better part of 3 decades, and we will continue for the length of our days to glean fresh outlook from his way of thinking and learning. Rabbi Sachs takes a different path than the classical commentators who find a test in Avraham's willingness to sacrifice. It is, in fact, a test that we're witnessing here. It does involve Isaac, and it does involve faith, but it's considerably more than that, as we'll see. Here's how Rabbi Sachs understands it. He writes, "What is truly perplexing in the entire Avraham narrative is the disconnect between God's promises and what appears to be reality. 7 different ways God promises Avraham the land, yet when Sarah dies, recall that he does not only does Avram have not so much as a plot to put his miss in, he's compelled by circumstance to buy one at an exorbitant price. Earlier in the story, God asked Avram to leave his homeland and his place of birth and his father's house and go to the land that God would show him. There, he would become great. No sooner does Avraham arrive that there's a famine in the land. The story with Egypt, where he's put in the difficult position of asking his wife to misrepresent herself, lest he, Avram, be killed, it's a moral quandary. The pattern that's beginning to emerge, as Rabbi Sachs describes it, is that Avram is learning that there is a long and winding road between promise and fulfillment. We always ask why. Why can't it just be simple? Why can't we understand things as they unfold? Why can't there be a straight line drawn between doing good and receiving good? Because we're pioneers, Sachs explains. What Avram was being called upon to do was to bring something new into the world, turning away from idolatry, a sacred society underpinned with the idea of covenant, a more intimate relationship with God than any nation had ever known. But this also demands a great strength of character, because we have to realize that, in his words, quote, nothing great and transformative happens overnight in the human realm. You have to have patience, fortitude, endurance. You have to keep forging ahead when you are tired and it seems like hope is lost, end quote. Sachs writes, God will bring about everything he promised, but not immediately and not directly. And God seeks the tenacity of those who keep going despite all the setbacks. That was what the life of Abraham was all about. On 4 separate occasions in the Avraham story, God promises him children. He says in chapter 12 of Genesis, I'll make you a great nation. In the next chapter after that, he says, I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, they could count your children. In chapter 15 again, look up at the stars and count them, if indeed you can count them. Then God says to him, that's how your offspring shall be. And in chapter 17, no longer will you be called Avram, but rather Avraham. For I will make you a father of great nations, God says to him. Av Hamon Goyim. I will make you fruitful. I will make many nations of you, and kings will descend from you. There was a child, Ishmael, a child by the maidservant Hagar, but he wasn't the one. It was Yitzchak. It was Isaac, born to parents at an advanced age. Once he was born, then God adjured Avraham, take this son, the only one that you love, Yitzchak, and offer him up. The trial was not to see if Avraham would do it, Sachs maintains. Many people did it in those days. That was not the test. It was also not to see if Avraham could part with something he loved. How many times had he proved that already? He gave up his land. He gave up his home. He gave up his firstborn son Ishmael, whom he also loved. It wasn't about that. The trial, says Sachs, was to see whether Avraham could live with what looked like a clear contradiction between God's word now and God's word on 5 previous occasions, promising him children and a covenant that would be continued by Isaac. We often have 2 verses in the Torah that seem, on the face of it, to contradict one another, and we have to live with the tension until a 3rd verse is found to reconcile them. At the beginning of our davening on usual mornings, we've been eliding it in COVID times, but we still say it at home before we come to shul, we have the 13 hermeneutical principles of textual interpretation, the Braisa de Rebbe Yishmael. Point number 13 of these says, V'chein shnei chsuvim hamachishim zeh et zeh. You have 2 verses that contradict, Ad sheyavo hakas v'shlishi v'yachriya b'neihem. Then a 3rd verse appears to reconcile the tension, to resolve this tension. This, says Sachs, is Abraham's situation. Except until the Akedah, which we read on Rosh Hashana and we read every day, Avraham himself doesn't know the resolution. He doesn't know how to resolve this tension. He's stuck between 2 things. On the one hand, your progeny will be as numerous as the stars, and on the other, take your son and bring him up as an offering. This is the test, writes Sachs. Could Abraham live with uncertainty? What a great summary of the human condition. Can we live with uncertainty, with not knowing how the story ends, with seeming contradictions, with apparent tensions that look on the face of it to be unresolvable? Sachs walks us through the steps of the story as we'll read them on Wednesday morning. Avraham tells no one where he's going. When Yitzchak asks, where's the sacrifice? The father says, God will show us the sacrifice, my son. Or without punctuation, of which the Torah has none, God will show us the sacrifice, my son. Some say that these are diplomatic evasions. Each reply is ambiguous. Sachs says, not so. Avraham is telling everything he knows. He meant exactly what he said. He is living the contradiction. So in this reading, Akedas Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, the whole chapter 22 of Genesis, it's not about sacrifice, it's about uncertainty. Again, Sachs's words, quote, he believed that the God who promised him a son would not allow him to sacrifice that son, but he did not know how the contradiction between God's promise and God's command would resolve itself, unquote. Sachs borrows a term from literary criticism, negative capability. It's the ability to live with uncertainty, with mystery, with doubt. It's the ability to be open to life in all its complexity, its conflicts, its contradictions. Once more, Sachs's words, quote, "I believe that Abraham taught us that faith is not certainty. It is the courage to live with uncertainty. He had negative capability. He knew the promises would come true. He could live with the uncertainty of not knowing how or when." Rabbi Sachs gave us this essay less than 2 years ago, at the beginning of 5780, November of 2019, a few months before COVID, a few more months before he would remove himself from public life to battle the illness that took him from us exactly a year after he wrote this. Perhaps one thing that we have had to live with more than anything else in the past 18 months has been uncertainty. No need to go into detail about how the pandemic made most things that we were certain of in life uncertain. No need to emphasize how the death of some of our great lights, like Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory, threatened the way forward with uncertainty. Don't we always have the leaders that we need? How could we move forward? How can we move forward without the confidence and faithful leadership of our great rabbis, our great teachers? No need to underscore the misery of having our routine, our social life, our interpersonal connections completely shaken up. We want to ask God, just tell me why this is all happening, so at least I can understand it. We don't. We have had to learn to live with uncertainty. And that's exactly the point that Rabbi Sachs is teaching us with this reflection on the Akedah. Abraham's faith told him that it would eventually all come together, but it would take a while, and it would not always be clear going along the way. We hope to understand what goes on in our lives, and that each step of the way should make sense and follow logically from one to the next. Faith, the most mature and most profound that Abraham models for us and that Rabbi Sachs teaches us, is not certainty, but the ability to live with uncertainty. That kind of faith has been what got us this far in one of the most uncertain periods of our lives, and what will carry us forward to better days. When we sound the shofar on Rosh Hashana, may we recall the event of Abraham's binding of Isaac with renewed faith and admiration for the ability that it gives us to live with uncertainty. When we read the story on the second day of Yom Tov, may we recall so many of our ancestors who forged ahead with confidence and faith, not knowing what would happen, but knowing that eventually it would be good. When we enjoy a slice of apple with a taste of honey, may we know in the depths of our souls that this year will be sweet. May it be sooner rather than later. May it always be happy and healthy. And may we all enjoy aksiva v'chasima tova. May we be inscribed and sealed for good in the book of life. Chag Sameach.